1944. A German officer's mess, somewhere behind the Western Front. A proper table, a cloth on it. China that has survived from better days. A bottle of wine that came up from France while there was still a France to bring wine up from. If you were a German officer, this was normal. And it was correct. And it was the way an army was supposed to work. You ate differently from your men. Not necessarily lavishly. By 1944, nobody in the German army was eating lavishly, but differently, and better, and separately. There was an officer's ration. There was an officer's mess. There was wine. And there were the small refinements that marked you out as what you were, which was a member of an officer corps that traced its traditions back through the Kaiser's army to Frederick the Great, and that regarded the distinction between the officer and the enlisted man as one of the load-bearing walls of military life. This was not corruption. It was not greed. It was doctrine. The officer was a different kind of man, with a different kind of responsibility, and it was natural and right that he should be fed, housed, and treated in a way that reflected that difference. Every European army had worked this way for centuries. The Germans simply did it with more conviction than most. And then you captured an American supply dump, or you overran an American position, or you sat across a table from a captured American officer, and you began to notice something that did not make sense. The American lieutenant ate the same food as the American private. Not similar food, the same food, out of the same cans, from the same kitchen, in the same line. A captured American mess kit belonging to a colonel contained the same ration as one belonging to a rifleman. The officer might go through the chow line after his men, rather than before them. Some units made a point of exactly that. But at the end of the line, what landed on his tray was what landed on theirs. And the food itself was the thing that truly did not compute. Because it was not just equal. It was abundant, in a way that a German officer, by 1944, no longer was. The American private was eating meat, regularly. He was eating fruit, tinned and sometimes fresh. He had coffee, real coffee, not the roasted acorn substitute the German army had been drinking for years. He had sugar. He had chocolate. He had cigarettes by the carton. He had, in some accounts that German soldiers frankly refused to believe until they saw it, ice cream. The German officer, eating his correct and proper and increasingly thin officer's ration, was being out-eaten by an American teenager with no rank at all. And the conclusion the German officer reached was the conclusion his entire culture had trained him to reach. It was decadence. It was softness. It was a nation of shopkeepers who did not understand that war is about hardship and sacrifice and the willingness to go without. An army that fed its privates ice cream was not a serious army. It was a spoiled one, and spoiled things break when they are tested. He was wrong. He was completely, catastrophically, revealingly wrong. And the thing he was looking at was not decadence at all. It was a philosophy about the value of a human being, and it was the same philosophy that built the whole American war, showing up one more time on a dinner tray. This is not a story about food. This is a forensic audit of two armies' answers to a single question, and the question is the deepest one an army ever has to answer. It is this: how much is one ordinary soldier worth? The German army had one answer. The American army had a completely different one. And you can read the entire outcome of the war in the West off the difference between them, starting with what was on the plate. Part 1. The German Calculus. Let us be fair to the German officer, because this story does not work if you think he was simply a snob getting his comeuppance. The German army's system of feeding was built on a theory, and the theory was not stupid. It held that an army is a hierarchy, that the hierarchy must be visible and maintained, and that the distinction between those who command and those who obey is the thing that holds the whole structure together under the unbearable stress of combat. If the officer is to send men to their deaths, and that is his function, that is the terrible thing an officer does, then the officer must be set apart. He must be a figure of authority, and authority, in the European military tradition, was expressed through visible distinction. Separate quarters, separate mess, separate ration. The Batman who served the officer. The whole apparatus of rank made visible in daily life. This was not unique to Germany. The British had it. The French had it. Every old world army had it, to some degree. It was simply how armies had always worked, and the Germans, being the most professionally military society in Europe, maintained it with particular seriousness. But underneath the tradition was an assumption, and it is the assumption that matters, and it is the assumption that lost the war. The assumption was that the ordinary soldier was, fundamentally, expendable, not worthless. The German soldier was valued, drilled, disciplined, and often genuinely cared for by good officers, but expendable in the specific sense that he was a replaceable component. The individual lancer, the ordinary German infantryman, was one of millions, interchangeable, a unit of combat power to be expended in pursuit of the mission. His death was a cost of doing business. The system was designed to extract the maximum fighting value from him before that cost was paid, and a system that regards the ordinary man as expendable will, quite logically, not invest heavily in his comfort, his survival, or his ice cream. Why would it? You do not lavish resources on a component you expect to consume. You feed him enough to fight, and you reserve the refinements for the men whose individual judgment actually matters, the officers. That is the deep logic under the separate mess. It is not merely snobbery. It is a rational allocation of scarce resources by an institution that has decided, at a fundamental level, that most of its men are means rather than ends. Now layer the material collapse on top of the philosophy, because by 1944 both were in play. The German ration, on paper, was a reasonable thing. Bread, meat, fats, potatoes, sugar, coffee substitute, a little tobacco, calculated, scaled to activity, thought about by professionals. What arrived was a different matter. By the last year of the war, the German soldier in the West was frequently hungry, and the reasons are the reasons that run through every episode of this series. No fuel to move the rations, no trucks, no trains, because the track was bombed, no safe movement in daylight, because the sky belonged to the enemy. The food existed, in depots, on paper, in the rear, and it could not get forward. So the German army arrived at a situation of grim symbolism. The officers' separate rations still existed, still marked the distinction, still expressed the hierarchy, but it was a distinction between a hungry private and a slightly less hungry officer. The tradition survived, the substance behind it had drained away, and there is one small object that captures the whole German food situation better than any statistic, and it is the coffee. The German soldier, for most of the war, did not drink coffee. He drank Ersatz cafe, substitute coffee, because real coffee comes from beans that grow in tropical countries, and Germany, blockaded and landlocked and cut off from the world's trade, could not get them. So German chemists and food producers did what they did with everything they lacked. They built a substitute. Ground roasted barley, roasted chicory root, roasted acorns, sometimes roasted rye, brewed up to look, more or less, like coffee, and to be called coffee, and to be nothing at all like coffee. That word, Ersatz, substitute, is the single most important word in the entire German war economy. Ersatz coffee, Ersatz rubber, Ersatz fuel, Ersatz fats. An entire civilization of substitutes, each one a clever chemical workaround for a thing the country could not obtain, each one slightly worse than the real thing, and all of them together adding up to a nation fighting the richest economies on earth with imitations. And in the Americans' captured pack, or on the Americans' captured mess tray, the German soldier found the real thing. Actual coffee, from actual beans, grown in Brazil or Colombia, shipped across an ocean the Americans controlled, roasted and ground and issued to a private, as though it were nothing. To hold a packet of real American coffee, if you were a German soldier who had been drinking roasted acorns for 3 years, was to hold a small brown packet of proof that you were on the losing side of something much larger than a battle. So the German army arrived at a situation of grim symbolism. The officers' separate rations still existed, still marked the distinction, still expressed the hierarchy, but it was a distinction between a hungry private drinking acorns and a slightly less hungry officer drinking slightly better acorns. The tradition survived. The substance behind it had drained away. And across the line was an army that had looked at the entire question, the hierarchy, the ration, the value of the ordinary man, and had answered it in a way that no European officer corps could quite believe. That is the German calculus, a proud tradition of visible hierarchy, resting on an unspoken assumption that the ordinary soldier was an expendable means to an end, hollowed out by a supply collapse that left even the officers thin, and utterly unable to comprehend an enemy who fed his privates like they were the most valuable thing he owned, because in that enemy's system, they were. Now let us look at the American tray. Part 2. The American answer. The American decision that its officers and its enlisted men would eat. Fundamentally, the same food was not an accident, and it was not simply a happy consequence of abundance. It was closer to an ideology. The United States Army was the army of a country that told itself a particular story about itself, a story about equality, about the common man, about the absence of a hereditary aristocracy, about the idea that a general and a private were, underneath the uniform, the same kind of citizen with the same fundamental worth. Like every national story, it was partly true and partly a flattering myth. The American Army was not actually a classless utopia. It had a rigid rank structure, it had privilege, and it was, at the time, racially segregated in ways that made an absolute mockery of any claim to equality. But in this one specific, concrete, daily matter, the food, the story was, to a striking degree, actually true. The chow line was, by the standards of the German officers' mess, radically egalitarian, and it reflected a genuine and consequential belief that ran right through the American war effort. The belief that the individual soldier was not an expendable means. He was the point. Look at how the Americans fed their army, because the machinery is the argument. They ran a research laboratory whose entire purpose was the science of feeding soldiers, the same institution that gave us the K-ration in an earlier episode. They developed a whole graduated system of rations for different circumstances. The C-ration, canned wet food for combat. The K-ration, the compact box for men on the move. The D-ration, the emergency chocolate. And, crucially, the B-ration and the field kitchen. Because the Americans understood something about hot food that goes far beyond nutrition. They understood that a hot meal is a psychological weapon. The United States Army moved mobile field kitchens as far forward as it possibly could, and it went to extraordinary lengths to get a hot meal to men in the line, because the Army had concluded, correctly, that a man who gets a hot meal feels cared for, and a man who feels cared for fights better and breaks later. The meal was not just calories. It was a message. The message was, you are worth the effort. Somebody, somewhere behind you, is working to get a hot meal to you specifically, because you matter. The German system sent that message to its officers. The American system sent it to everybody. And there is a small ritual that made the philosophy visible, and it is worth describing because it is the exact inverse of the German officers' mess. In many American units, it was a point of principle, sometimes a written rule, sometimes just the mark of a good officer, that the officers ate last. The men went through the chow line first. The lieutenant, the captain, sometimes the colonel, stood at the back and ate what was left after his men had been fed. A good American officer took the position that his men's stomachs came before his own. Now hold the two images side by side, because together they are the whole argument. The German officer ate first, and separately, and better, because his rank entitled him to it, and the distinction was the point. The American officer ate last, and the same, and only after his men, because his rank obligated him to it, and the equality was the point. These are not two versions of the same army with different table manners. They are two completely different theories of what an officer is, and what a soldier is worth, and what the relationship between them ought to be. The German theory said the officer is above the men. The American theory said the officer is responsible for the men, and responsibility, in the American reading, meant you fed them first. A German officer, watching an American colonel wait at the back of the chow line, would not have seen humility or good leadership. He would have seen a breakdown of proper order, an officer demeaning himself, a failure to maintain the distinction that held an army together. He was watching, in fact, the visible surface of the organizing principle that was going to beat him. The German system sent the message of care to its officers. The American system sent it to everybody and made the officers deliver it. And then there is the ice cream, and I want to spend a moment on the ice cream because it is the single most revealing object in this entire episode, and the German officer who sneered at it understood it least of all. The American military produced and distributed ice cream to its troops on a scale that is genuinely difficult to believe. It was regarded as important for morale, formally, officially, as a matter of policy. Units built improvised ice cream freezers. Ice cream was flown to forward positions. The Navy, late in the war, commissioned a floating concrete barge whose sole purpose was to manufacture ice cream for sailors in the Pacific, at a cost that would have bought a great deal of ammunition. To the German officer, this was the final proof of American unseriousness. A nation building ice cream barges while fighting a world war was a nation that did not understand what war was. But look at what the ice cream actually represented, because it is the whole thing in a single absurd, brilliant image. It represented an industrial economy so vast that it could fight the largest war in human history and still have enough surplus capacity, enough ships, enough refrigeration, enough sugar, enough sheer everything to make ice cream for privates as a matter of routine. The ice cream was not a sign that America was not serious about the war. It was a sign that America was so overwhelmingly capable of fighting the war that morale ice cream was a rounding error. And it represented the deeper thing. It represented an army that had decided the comfort and the morale and the survival of its ordinary men was worth spending real resources on. Not because it was sentimental, but because it had done the calculation and concluded that a well-fed, well-cared-for soldier was a more effective soldier, and that the ordinary soldier was worth investing in because the ordinary soldier was who actually won wars. The German officer ate separately because his men were expendable. The American private ate ice cream because he was not. That is the whole war, on a tray, with a scoop on top. Part 3. The River of Steel. The numbers behind the American tray are, like all the numbers in this series, difficult to hold in the mind. The United States Army's food service was one of the largest catering operations that had ever existed on Earth. It was feeding millions of men, 3 meals a day, across multiple continents and 2 oceans, and it was doing it while also feeding a good part of its allies, and while shipping food to civilian populations, and while its own home front barely tightened its belt. American per-man calorie provision ran to something in the region of 4,000 or more calories a day for a soldier in the field, a figure calculated by nutritionists, delivered by an enormous logistical apparatus, and sustained across the entire war. The ration was designed by scientists, manufactured by industry, and delivered by the same river of trucks and ships that carried the fuel and the shells. And here is the comparison that ends the argument. As the war ground on, the gap between what an American soldier ate and what a German soldier ate did not narrow, it widened. The American soldier's provision stayed high because the system behind it was untouchable, an ocean away from any bomber, running at a fraction of its true capacity. The German soldier's provision fell, and kept falling, because the system behind it was being systematically destroyed. By the end, in some sectors, the contrast was grotesque. Starving, or near-starving, German troops overran American positions in the Ardennes and found stores of food that represented a level of abundance they had not seen in years. And there are numerous accounts of German attacks physically stalling because the attacking soldiers stopped to eat, to loot the rations, to fill their pockets, unable to help themselves in the face of American plenty. Think about what that means as a military fact. The German offensive in the Ardennes, the last great German gamble in the West, was slowed, in places, not by American resistance, but by American food. German soldiers stopped fighting in order to eat, because the food in front of them was a kind of abundance their own army could no longer imagine, let alone provide. An army whose attacks stall because the enemy's rations are too tempting is an army that has already lost the deeper war, the war of which the shooting is only the surface. And I want to widen the lens for a moment, because the food gap was not only between the two armies, it was between the two home fronts, and that is where it becomes truly damning. America fought the entire Second World War without seriously going hungry. There was rationing, Sugar, meat, butter, coffee were controlled. But it was rationing in the sense of managed plenty, not rationing in the sense of want. The American civilian ate well throughout the war. American agriculture, the most productive on earth, fed the army, fed the civilians, fed a large share of the Allied populations, and shipped a river of food to Britain and the Soviet Union on top of it all. Germany, by contrast, had entered both world wars with the memory of starvation hanging over it. In the First World War, the Allied blockade had produced real famine in Germany, the turnip winter, civilians dead of hunger and its diseases, a national trauma that shaped everything that came after. The German leadership was so haunted by that memory that feeding the home front became a political obsession. And one of the ways they fed the German home front in the Second World War was by systematically stripping the food out of the countries they occupied, taking the harvest of France, of Poland, of Ukraine, and in the occupied East, deliberately starving millions to feed Germans. So even Germany's food supply was a kind of desperate theft, a robbing of the conquered to stave off the hunger at home, while America simply grew more than it could eat and gave the surplus away. Two war economies. One so rich it made ice cream for privates and shipped food to its enemies' enemies. One so poor it starved the occupied to feed the homeland and gave its soldiers acorns to drink. The food on the tray was not an isolated fact. It was the visible tip of the entire disparity between the two nations, showing up where a soldier could taste it. An army whose attacks stall because the enemy's rations are too tempting is an army that has already lost the deeper war, the war of which the shooting is only the surface. And the food was only the most visible expression of it. Behind the food stood the same total system we have traced through fuel and tanks and medicine and winter clothing, the same industrial base, the same logistical genius, the same underlying decision, made at the highest level, to spend the country's colossal material wealth on the survival, the effectiveness, and yes, the comfort of the individual soldier, because the individual soldier was understood to be the thing the entire war was actually about. The Germans built an army around the mission and spent the men to achieve it. The Americans built an army around the men and achieved the mission by keeping them fed, healthy, equipped, and alive. One of those armies fed its generals well. The other fed everybody well. And the second one won. Part 4. The German realization. The Germans saw it. As always, they saw it. They were not blind. And captured American supplies were a constant, humiliating, undeniable education in the material reality of the enemy. German soldiers who looted American ration dumps knew with absolute concrete certainty that the enemy was eating better than they were. There was no propaganda that could survive contact with an American supply depot. The coffee was real, the meat was there, the chocolate, the cigarettes, the sheer casual plenty of it. Every German soldier who saw it understood, at a level below argument, that something was profoundly different about the two sides. But here is the realization they mostly did not make, because their culture actively prevented them from making it. They interpreted the abundance as softness, and they held on to that interpretation even as it killed them, because the alternative interpretation was unbearable. The alternative interpretation was this: that the American army fed its privates like officers, not because it was decadent, but because it had correctly understood something the German officer corps, for all its brilliance, had gotten wrong at the most fundamental level. That the ordinary soldier is not an expendable means to the mission. That he is the most valuable asset the nation possesses. That investing in him, his food, his health, his survival, his morale, his ice cream, is not weakness or indulgence, but the single most rational thing a war-fighting nation can do, because a nation that preserves and cares for its soldiers ends up with more soldiers, more experienced soldiers, more willing soldiers, and more effective soldiers than a nation that treats them as ammunition. To accept that would have required the German officer to question the deepest assumption of his entire professional caste, the assumption that the distinction between the officer and the man was natural, necessary, and correct. It would have required him to see the American chow line, where the colonel eats after the private, not as a breakdown of proper order, but as a superior organizing principle. And almost none of them could do it. It was too deep. It went to the root of who they understood themselves to be. So they clung to contempt. They called the Americans soft and materialistic and unmilitary, and they said it right up to the end, even as the soft, materialistic, unmilitary Americans fed, healed, equipped, and preserved their way across Europe and into the heart of the Reich. There were German officers, thoughtful ones who wrote memoirs afterwards, who came close to understanding it, who grasped that the war had been lost not on the battlefield, but in the factory and the supply depot and the fundamental decision about what a nation owed its soldiers. But even they tended to frame it as a matter of quantity. The Americans simply had more, rather than as a matter of philosophy. The Americans had decided the ordinary man was worth more. The quantity was real, but the quantity flowed from the philosophy. America outproduced Germany, in part because it had decided that production, in the service of the ordinary soldier and the ordinary citizen, was what the whole enormous effort was for. The German officer ate at a separate table to the very end. He was still defending a distinction, long after the thing the distinction was supposed to protect had been lost. If your father, your grandfather, or your uncle served in the Quartermaster Corps, cooked in a field kitchen, ran a mess, drove a ration truck, or was one of the men who somehow got a hot meal forward to soldiers in the line, or if he was simply one of the millions who ate that food and remembered, for the rest of his life, a hot meal or a scoop of ice cream in a terrible place, I would be grateful to hear his name and his unit in the comments. The men who fed the army are almost never remembered. They are mostly gone now. What remains are the stories their families carry. Those stories belong in the record. Part 5. The Verdict. 1945. The war is over, and the accountants of history sit down to explain how the thing was actually won, and they reach, mostly, for the big and obvious answers: production, numbers, oil, steel, the sheer overwhelming material weight of the Allied economies. And all of that is true, but it sits on top of something deeper, and the food is the clearest window onto it, because the food is where the philosophy became visible 3 times a day on a metal tray. So here is the verdict. The German officer who sneered at the American private's ice cream was not looking at a weakness. He was looking at the exact thing that was about to defeat him, and he could not see it, because seeing it would have meant surrendering the deepest belief of his professional life. He believed the ordinary soldier was expendable. Everything in his tradition told him so. The separate mess, the separate ration, the whole visible architecture of hierarchy rested on the quiet certainty that most men are means, and only a few are ends. The Americans had made the opposite bet. They had decided, not perfectly, not consistently, not without enormous hypocrisies, but decisively where it counted, that the ordinary soldier was an end in himself, that he was worth feeding like an officer, worth healing with penicillin, worth pulling out of a burning tank, worth keeping his feet dry, worth an entire industrial civilization bent to the task of keeping him alive and effective, and, when possible, even comfortable. And that bet won. It won because it was not sentiment. It was correct. A nation that invests in the ordinary soldier gets, in return, an army that is better fed, better equipped, better healed, better preserved, and, over the length of a long war, more experienced and more effective than an army that spends its men to save its resources. The Germans fed their generals well and their soldiers poorly, and they lost their soldiers, and then they lost the war. The Americans fed everybody and kept everybody, and the everybody won it. The German officer could afford to eat at a separate table. The American private could afford to eat like a general. And in the end, it was the private's army that was standing. If this forensic audit gave you something to think about, hit the like button. It keeps this channel visible to the people who want the history the way it actually happened. Subscribe if you want the next audit, because there are more of these. More systems, more decisions, more of the ordinary, invisible, unglamorous machinery that decided who won and who came home. And remember this about the men who did the feeding. Nobody puts up a statue to a cook. There is no monument to the mess sergeant who dragged a field kitchen up a shelled road so that 80 exhausted men could have something hot before they went back into it. He did not carry a rifle into the assault. He carried a ladle and a coffee urn and a stack of trays. He was not trying to be a hero. He was trying to make sure that in the worst place on earth, On the worst day of a man's life, there was a hot meal and a familiar face and a moment, just a moment, of being treated like somebody who mattered. Mostly, there was. They deserved to be remembered by name, by unit, and by the simple, quietly revolutionary idea they served 3 times a day, that every single man in that army, whatever his rank, was worth feeding well.